Hello, my name is Gemma Moss and I am starting this event. Welcome everybody. I'm amused that in the poll so far we've got 100% voting that they think we can have high standards without high stakes. I'm hoping that we will get some good discussion of the issues through this event. I and Pam Salmons are the speakers who will be talking you through the proposals in the BERA report. Bernadita Munoz-Shiro, who's our co-author, will be picking up and leading on the panel discussion later. I'm going to, if we move on to the next slide, you will see that as panel discussants, we have with us Dr. Kulvan Atwal. He will be starting us off with a discussion of why the Quest test is flawed from a teacher's perspective. And after Pam and I have finished our presentation of the BERA report, we welcome 3 panel discussants to the session. Professor of Educational Assessment at University of Oxford, Joanne Baird, MP Margaret Greenwood, who was Shadow Minister for Schools for a while, and we're delighted is able to be with us, and Matt Morden, co-head teacher at Surrey Square Primary School. We're hoping that we will get a good discussion from the panel, and there will be plenty of opportunities to ask questions from the audience. In the next slide, you will see this is the title of the report, and there's the full list of authors. If we move on to the next slide, I just want to tell you a little bit about who the BERA expert panel on assessment are. And in particular, I want to highlight Harvey Goldstein's role in the panel's work. He first floated to us the idea of using a national sample to radically transform the ways in which accountability runs in the English school system. Unfortunately, he died of COVID very early on in the pandemic and is not with us. I and Pam Salmons are the authors who are presenting. Gordon Stobart, another key contributor, unfortunately is in Canada and without Wi-Fi access. Bernie will be here as chair, and Sean Hayes and Gwen Simmers are both in the audience. So you're going to get a full account of what we've done. If the technical side of the report was initially Harvey's, all the mistakes are ours. On the next slide, you will see that this report builds on a previous report on a baseline without basis. That was our review of the reception baseline assessment, which floated and identified some of the key problems really in the English assessment system as it stands. A reception baseline assessment collects information from 4-year-olds, it stores this for 7 years, and then thinks it can use it to assess the quality of the school input between age 4 and 11. This is entirely unproven as a method. We do not know if you can detach schools' performance from the difference in performance scores that pupils achieve. Meanwhile, any use that the data collected might be for schools, there is none. This seems like an accountability system gone mad that monitors intensively, polices intensively, and has very little function in creating system improvement. So our suggestions are really to re-alter that and to try and make things work better. On the next slide, I'm going to introduce Dr. Kulvan Atwal, who's going to be talking to us about why the Quest test is flawed. You will see on the same slide a very large number of tests that happen in the English system to try and collect data on pupils. Kulvan, over to you.
Thank you, Gemma. First of all, I feel very privileged to have the opportunity to speak to you from the perspective of a head teacher. And just a quick point about reception baseline. I work in, I'm head teacher of 2 schools in East London, and there's every possibility that less than 50% of the children that join us in reception will be with us when they leave year 6. So that's just an example of how flawed the baseline assessment potentially can be. Right, so I've got about 5 minutes, so I'm just going to give you a few provocations. So the first one is, surely the business of education is to support children's learning. SATs are not about supporting children's learning or even capturing children's learning. They are simply about holding schools to account at a national level. That's a national accountability system that is focused on judging schools, not about the individual interests of children. So we need to find a better way of holding schools to account. And what we're going to be talking about today is an alternative and how we need to consider that alternative. SATs only measure that which is easily measurable. Okay, so basically we're looking at schools in written tests in reading, spelling, punctuation and grammar and maths. So really we're assessing their learning out of context. They do not measure children's oracy, they do not measure children's social skills, they do not measure children's cognitive development, their critical thinking skills, their teamwork, or their emotional literacy. And the way in which schools move their resources to focus on SATs in year 6 is actually damaging to children's social, emotional, and academic development. Why do they do that? In the average school, the curriculum is narrowed because of the pressures of national accountability systems to enable children to prepare for these high-stake tests, which are completely unnecessary. Decisions are not therefore made in the best interest of the children's learning. They are made to prepare children for these written tests. So even if you look at the reading assessment, it's more of a writing assessment rather than a deeper understanding of children's reading comprehension. I do not question the fact that schools have to narrow the curriculum in year 6 because they are judged on the outcomes of these assessments. I'm not arguing that children shouldn't have to take tests. Children do not have a problem with taking tests, and I have no problem with tests. However, it is better for teachers to use tests as part of a rounded assessment of children's learning at the end of Key Stage 2. The value in terms of their movement up to Key Stage 3 is negligible. Give you a very brief example. I believe that children's writing has actually improved since the assessment of children's writing moved away from a high stakes test to teacher assessment. So since we stopped having a writing test for children at the end of Key Stage 2 and moved to teacher assessment, the quality of children's writing has improved. Not only has the quality of teachers' writing improved, but actually the quality of teachers' teaching of writing has improved. So why take a full year of teaching and reduce it to 9 months just for external accountability? So these children have to take these high stakes tests in May of their year 6. So essentially you're taking, and this is particularly so with this concept of catch up, you're taking what should be 12 months of deep engagement in a creative curriculum and reducing it to 9 months because of this preparation for tests. And because of the high stakes accountability, I have to be very sympathetic, but I am also aware that the curriculum for the average year 6 child is narrowed because of the focus on these tests. So instead of cramming the curriculum for tests in May and then doing all the fun stuff in June and July, we could provide a more broad, balanced and personalised curriculum throughout that year, and we would provide more accurate assessments for secondary schools. Secondary schools do not use SATs tests. Those SATs tests are used primarily and solely for school accountability. How are the SATs really used other than for external assessment purposes? Even Ofsted have now adjusted their assessment criteria because they are concerned about the narrowing of the curriculum in year 6, and they want to evaluate the quality of the curriculum rather than the extent to which schools cram their children for tests. Now, Gemma, I was asked to do 5 minutes. I think I've done that 5 minutes just about right.
Thank you very much, Kulvan. That is absolutely brilliant. And you have made us a really good start. I think it really does matter to listen to voices from the school system itself, highlighting some of the disadvantages. I noticed this event is very timely because the DFE today has announced what it will be doing with tests next year. Tests next year will go ahead. They will be used to benchmark schools. What does benchmarking schools mean in this context? It means setting them against the normal distribution curve, in which some will be at the bottom, some will be at the top, and some of them will be in the middle. What it completely ignores and won't be able to collect information on is how COVID has impacted on different schools in different places. I'm currently collecting case study data on this. We have schools that perversely have had a good COVID, even though they've had children with high numbers of free school meals, because their workers have been employed in health, are essential workers, and 50% of the school population has been in school the entire time. We have other schools with very similar levels of free school meals, where the whole system has been profoundly disrupted, kids living in multi-generational households, a lot of fear on the part of parents in terms of bringing in kids into school. Some of our schools, our case study schools, were already equipped with a good use of IT. Other school populations didn't have digital at home. Unless you collect that kind of contextual information, you will not be able to make any sense of the test data next year. Okay, if we move on to the next slide, I'm now going to start talking you through what are our proposals to change the system. So if we're going to go straight onto the slide, the next slide. This is the aims of our report. We want to make a accountability system that works differently. Instead of high stakes testing and accountability, we want intelligent accountability geared towards building system knowledge that informs school improvement and, importantly, leads to more equitable outcomes. At the moment, those schools judged most harshly under the current test regime simply get outsourced from the system and turned into academies. We know that this doesn't necessarily help them do any better. They need better information to improve the offer that they are making to the children in their context. We want a more democratic accountability system that fosters meaningful engagement between all stakeholders so that everybody can see what the problems are and think about what we might do about them. To deliver on these aims, we need to collect richer information. We can only do this or do it appropriately from a smaller number of pupils. That's why we're going for a national sample. And we think an important part of the new system is to create independent bodies with new remits who will be able to manage it on our behalf. Next slide. Okay, so for democratic accountability, this means we need independent oversight. We are proposing, alongside composing a national sample, new testing instruments, organisational change. We need an independent organisation to recruit and manage knowledge gathering from a national sample that will be intelligent and help inform system improvement. We need an independent body to develop a bank of assessment and survey instruments that can do so much more than the current instruments in our system. Listen to what Pulvan was saying about the narrow range of skills that's currently tested. We want better assessment instruments, and crucially, we want to add survey instruments, surveying pupils, parents, teachers in their school environment to better understand those contextual aspects of education that really do make a difference. All of this would allow us to decouple accountability from rather simplistic judgments of quality based on too little information and ignoring the contextual factors that really do make a difference to schools. We will remake accountability based on the richer data we collect, and all of this means that there will be a new role for Ofsted, supporting school improvement and drawing on the research data that we collect through the national sample. We think this will reconfigure how Ofsted functions. I'm now going to hand over to my fellow contributor. I think, oh no, I'm not actually. Okay, next slide. This is a simple sum up. It's a diagrammatic sum up of what we think we're doing. In the inner circle, you will see two new bodies, one to oversee the national sample, one to create the assessment tools, The assessment tools once made, yes, they will be used on the national sample to collect information on how the national system is functioning, but we see that body making a very broad set of test instruments that schools can pick and choose between. They can choose the assessment instrument that supports their needs, supports their teaching mid-year. They will be able to draw those down. Assessment instruments will enable schools to continue reporting to parents on their children's attainment and development. Because they're rich with tools, they will give much better information back to parents than the simple scale scores they get at the moment. All of this will allow inspection to be reformed and rich data used to explore the system. Next slide. Okay, so this is our proposal in a nutshell. You'll hear us getting back to these points again and again as we go through. There's going to be a longitudinal national sample. Assessment and survey data will be used on the national sample, but they'll also be available to schools who can draw them down and use them as they see fit. We think national reports on what has been gathered through the national sample will aid system monitoring at the national level, but crucially, it will also help Ofsted use inspection in a much more positive way to support system improvement. And the independent bodies we design are there to ensure research integrity in the way the system runs. The next slide, we're not going to hover over, we're just going to show it you very briefly. If you go to our report, this is what you will see. These are the recommendations in our report. And now I really will hand over to my fellow speaker, Pam Salmons, and report author. Pam, over to you.
Thanks very much, Gemma. Well, I'm going to turn to the intelligent accountability aspect of our proposals and explore that in a bit more depth. But we've had a very good introduction from Dr. Kulvan, giving us a very good rationale from a school's perspective. So why do we need this? We want to replace school performance tables that are widely recognised as not fit for purpose. And as we showed in our baseline report in more detail, and as 40 years of education effectiveness research have shown, the crude ranking of school performance and the judgments, decontextualized judgments based on a narrow set of tests, are invalid. They're invalid partly because of statistical uncertainty associated with all measures, whether they're of an individual child or of a whole school group's performance, but they typically invariably penalise schools serving the most disadvantaged communities because of the powerful links between background and attainment that are not only evident in the English system, but in the vast majority of countries internationally. So by doing that, by replacing the performance tables with our longitudinal national sample, pressures to teach to the test would be eliminated, which would have curriculum benefits, as Kulvan said. The national sample would therefore provide much more authentic and accurate ways to monitor system equity. The measures would be more authentic because we wouldn't be, schools wouldn't be forced to try to teach to the test, narrow the curriculum away from a broad balance. The measures of performance, coaching children to perform well on a particular day, are not in their interests as learners. And because we would get a more realistic picture of performance, we would also be able to better monitor system equity due to the nature of our sample. And I'll come back to that. We'd also have this broader range of performance measures because we're going to lighten the burden, and I'll explain how our matrix sample will do that. They will give us a more detailed and helpful picture of pupil achievements and development, not just on the narrow outcomes of literacy and numeracy. Because the data will be anonymized but linked to the national pupil data, we will be able to make the comparisons of the performance for different groups of pupils. For example, by social disadvantage, gender, ethnic, and special educational needs and disability, SEND status. We will also be able to look at variations across different regions of the country, different local authority areas, by map providers, and areas of interest, different kinds of neighbourhood, coastal communities, rural communities, different kinds of urban communities. Next slide, please. Next, thank you. building on the best international practice and research evidence is vital to making this new intelligent accountability system work. There is much research that can provide more accurate ways to monitor system performance and equity at a lower cost, while refocusing on improvement. So we would make a better use of the resources. A number of other systems are trying to follow a similar route. For example, Australia is proposing to replace their testing system, NAPLAN, with a sample-based approach, which is fundamental to what we are proposing. The OECD in 2021 is now advocating sample-based monitoring. Sample-based systems make very little demand on teachers and schools, but provide extremely useful information. Sample-based monitoring systems of this kind require a long-term commitment and sustainable funding, as they need to outlive government. So again, one can move away from short-term political pressures by taking the system, as we propose, outside direct government control and having an independent bodies to monitor and oversee it. The longitudinal sample data will provide regular updates on pupils' educational progress and development and cover a broader range of important outcomes, the sort of outcomes that Kulban has talked about. Oracy, particularly communication skills, very important in the early years, science, social-emotional development and well-being, and so on. Next slide, please. Okay, the advantages of this longitudinal sampling. Well, let's look at the numbers, a question of numbers. In England, we have over 4.5 million, 4,660,000 pupils on primary roles. That's in nearly 17,000 primary schools and over 343 local authority areas. This is an enormous cost because every one of those children is assessed on all those different time points that you saw on the slide that Calvin talked to. Only in year 3 and year 5 are there no official national assessments, but many schools are using assessments to prepare for year 6. Our new approach instead proposes a series of national samples of between 250 and 500 pupils per local authority in a stratified random sample based on all schools. We get between 85,000 and 170,000 pupils approximately for each of the relevant age groups. We think year 2, year 6 and year 9. The exact sample sizes and timings could be decided by the new independent oversight body. We wouldn't propose collecting the data every year. We think biennially or every 3 years of a cycle will provide enough regular evidence to inform policy and practice without overburdening the system and freeing up resources for school improvement work and teaching and learning. And particularly the resources of teachers' time and children's time in primary schools. What's the difference between our approach and cross-sectional surveys? Well, it's in longitudinal nature. The national samples will be followed up to investigate pupils' progress and development across both primary and secondary phases up to year 9, and we would link it up with GCSE data, A-level data and beyond. We can do this because of the National Pupil Identifier. We would use encrypted school IDs to prevent misuse of data, but enabling linkages to collect the data on school and pupil characteristics that already exist in the MPD. This sample strategy and development will be informed by previous studies and relevant research organisation. In particular, I want to mention a few studies. The longitudinal EPSI study that went on from 1997 to 2014, effective provision of preschool, primary and secondary education, government funded across successive governments. We followed children from the age of 3 in preschool through primary and secondary education. There's also the Millennium Cohort study that built on some of the EPSI learning that gives us information about children's development longitudinally. We will build on the work of the former APU, the Assessment for Performance Units, that those of us who've been around in education for a long time will remember very well. But that was a cross-sectional survey. We'll build on the work of bodies such as National Foundation for Educational Research and cross-sectional approaches which have sample serving like PISA, TALIS and TIMSS internationally. The key feature is the test design is based on matrix sampling, which reduces the burden on any one individual child or school, but gives you robust information. And just to quote one international example, NEPS, the National Education Panel Study in Germany, is a very well developed system that built on some of the Millennium Cohort and EPSI research in England, but it provides regular expert advice for policymakers in Germany. Data is anonymized and available for researchers' use, and they have developed valuable self-report measures to look at other kinds of outcomes and the perspectives of different stakeholders in the system. Next slide, please. Okay, the new survey and assessment instruments. Gemma has mentioned some of this. We would have greater ability to collect additional measures because we're lightening the burden through our matrix sampling. So we would have measures of oracy skills, science, socio-emotional outcomes, including mental health and pupil well-being, particularly important in the current context post-COVID, or we're not post-COVID, in the current pandemic. We would have new contextual measures of pupils' experiences of school and teaching, and teachers' reports of their school working conditions. Such questionnaire-based measures can be well developed and have been used in a range of research studies in the past in our country and internationally. We would have a stronger focus on equity and comparisons of progress and development and experiences of different pupil groups, because it would be decoupled from judging school performance. So we wouldn't be teaching to the test. We would look at different groups of pupils' performance and monitor that. We would be able to look at neighbourhood disadvantage and regional disparities and inform inspection. And as I've mentioned before, we would have a sample of pupils who would have longitudinal follow-up and regular sampling so that the system would have regular up-to-date information. Next slide, please. Well, what are the advantages of what we call our novel approach, and why is it novel? It's novel because it's research informed. It's novel because it is not a cross-sectional sample, as in the former assessment of performance unit work in the 1980s, because of its longitudinal combination. Big advantage is reduced burden and stress for pupils and teachers alike through our matrix sample design. Each pupil would only be tested on a random subset of items from a much larger number designed to capture different features of curricular achievement and development. So the overall information would be richer, but the burden on children would be reduced. We therefore have brought better information on a broader range of outcomes from this sampling, matrix sampling. We would have greater transparency and reduced cost. These assessments would be made available to those who wish to use them for research and for schools, so that they could be encouraged to be more research informed in their own work. And that would help to support school self-evaluation and improvement. It would also help to support teaching and learning in the classroom for diagnosis and for monitoring individual children's progress, used by schools when they see it fit. And it would be a much better use of resources to support improvement. There would be less testing overall, but richer information. This would free up more resources, time and support to focus on improvement in the quality of pupils' learning experiences, their well-being and their all-round development. Next slide, please. Okay, what about the parents? Information for parents. Crucially, this would still be available. There would still be regular annual reports to parents on individual children's learning and development, as is the normal school practice. Summative end-of-year reports to parents would provide richer information on the individual child because they'd be less tied to scale scores benchmarked against the national performance in just a limited number of tests. But schools could draw down assessment instruments that are diagnostic in function, able to assess how children's learning is developing over time, supporting teaching differentiated to need, providing more opportunities for formative feedback, and additional measures and information about a broader range of outcomes. Also, the assessments could happen at different points across the year when schools and teachers felt most appropriate, and that would support high quality teaching across the curriculum. The national reports would be more informative because they'd cover a broader range of competencies. And overall, parents would have a much fuller picture of what their individual child can do and areas that might need extra support. And we think that's a very important point. The child would be more than a score, to quote one of an ongoing campaign's mantras. And if I go back to some of the helpful information over 40 years of research, my former colleagues, Joe and Peter Mortimer, many years ago argued on national public exams, they should be helpful servants and not domineering masters. I think that's what we want. The kind of information we have for parents about their children needs to be helpful. Thank you. I'm going to hand back to Gemma now.
Okay, on to the next slide. Somebody has asked in the chat, how would standards for individual schools be monitored and supported in this model? I think the trouble with the current accountability system is that it does a lot of monitoring, but it doesn't really do very much with the information it gets back. What we envisage is that through the national sample, we would get more intelligent reporting on what the state of the whole system is. We think that national reports will be able to fuel conversations between stakeholders at different system levels. So an individual school would indeed be able to benchmark itself against a school operating in similar circumstances. It might be able to understand whether it's facing similar or different issues. And from that point of view, it will help schools contextualize and review their own school improvement plans. This does mean we are planning on a system that will run on much higher trust. Part of the problem with the current system is it runs on incredibly low trust. During the COVID crisis, there has been no attempt by the DFE to monitor how schools themselves have been adjusting to and teaching through the difficult circumstances in which they find themselves. Everything has been reliant on somebody else, somewhere else, finding information and passing it down to schools. The real knowledge building in our education system happens at the front line in the interactions between pupils and teachers, and indeed between teachers and parents. We want to make that much more centre stage, turn these into constructive conversations, not pipe marking events. We think that schools being able to choose from their own bank of tests and survey instruments, note the survey instruments as well, that will help them explore the contextual factors that matter in their context. We also think that the system we're describing will enable schools and other stakeholders to nominate topics for further investigation. What about the issue, for instance, EAL kids coming into school and encountering English as a second language? Do they actually benefit from a greater stress on oracy, as well as a narrow curriculum that's geared towards phonics? There's good evidence that phonics does work very well for EAL students, but do they also need plenty of opportunities for talk and engagement that runs around reading and writing on a much broader perspective? Stakeholders would be able to ask that question and get the national sample to explore it. It means that the evidence base within the school system becomes richer and deeper, and it can respond to need out there. At the moment, the only needs that are making the system run are those far away in Whitehall monitoring system performance. We'd like to get more agency back down to the front line. Yes, that does mean trusting schools, but it also means that they can review their own performance, well supported in the kind of system that used to run in London Challenge, note the word challenge, where schools were challenged to review what they were doing in comparison to other schools. They could set out their own improvement plans on an annual basis for parents, which would say, these are the issues we think matter. This is what we're doing about it. So we think democratic accountability means more accountability of schools to their own communities, less tick box exercise from afar. We also think that the national report should provide the basis for investment decisions at a national level. And again, that's part of what's missing in our current accountability setup. It doesn't lead to investment in things that matter most. If we know that speaking and listening is really important, the language skills that children bring to school matters. I've used the Millennium Cohort studies, it certainly demonstrates that. Shouldn't we then be investing in parent-child settings in areas of greatest need, as Sure Start once did. These would become questions that research could settle, and that the research would help policymakers far distant from the front line have the evidence there at their hands to know which kind of investment will suit system improvement best. We also think that a national sample will allow monitoring of national system standards over time. And we hope that will help. Next slide. I'm almost out of time and we're coming to a close. I wanted to say a little bit more before we finished about what we see as a different role for Ofsted. Part of the problem with Ofsted at the moment, it itself has recognised that the performance data alone is not sufficient for its inspection monitoring visits, but otherwise it relies on observations by individual inspectors. This way round, the national sample data will be able to inform Ofsted prior to going into schools about the kinds of contextual issues that might matter here, and also be able to engage schools in intelligent conversation about what they themselves are doing. We envisage fewer, more topic-based inspections, perhaps selectively reviewing different subjects and domains in different years. And again, that's to improve the quality of the conversation that's happening between inspectors and the school system, so that professional knowledge is really stoked and fueled in that encounter, and we're not pushing schools back onto the defensive. Reports to parents could then be made by Ofsted that might indeed assess the school in the context of the national sample, but would draw attention to issues that require investment and pay attention to how schools themselves are actually picking those issues up. In addition, Ofsted would be in a good position to report to Parliament to provide feedback for policy development at a national level based on the national sample research evidence. And they would also be able to give a much greater impetus to school self-evaluation processes, which would work to benefit the system as a whole. We think this would really solve some of the problems in the system. So if we move to the next slide, I've got a couple more to go. This is our attempt to sum up why we think it's worth doing this. We think our proposals will enhance the educational experiences for all primary pupils. They will stop so much of the stuff that gets in the way that Kulvan drew our attention to when we started out in this webinar. It will also free up resources from annual testing of every single pupil and channel them into supporting school improvement. We think it will ensure that decisions over education are research informed and evidence-based. It will make a richer evidence base to fuel system knowledge, and it will crucially be able actively to take into account the contextual dimensions to pupils' learning and development that are so crucial. Or we think this means that it is geared to the interests and concerns of all stakeholders. A key ingredient will be ensuring the independence of system oversight and management. In the long term, we think this will create a more resilient and stable education system, better able to deliver on equity of outcomes. So next slide gives you a very brief summary of what it is we think our recommendations will change. We think it will require investment to make the system work. It won't be a overnight, we abolish everything, we start again. Instead, what it will do is give the new independent body, if Parliament were to create it, the responsibility to set the system up at a pace that makes sense. And then as the system transforms itself into a national sample-based system, there would indeed be opportunities to phase that out. I think that is where we come to the end. I'm going to check. Yes, it is. Okay, we now have a Slido question, and I'm going to hand over to Bernie at this point, who is going to pick up on the Slido questions and chair the remaining panel discussion. Welcome, Bernie.
Thank you very much, Gemma and Pam, for your presentation. And we have some questions now, and then we will have a 15-minute discussion from our panelists. That is a diverse panel. We have one academic, Joanne Bird, Professor of Education at University of Oxford, one policymaker, Margaret Greenwood, MP for Wirral West, and one head teacher, a practitioner, Matt Morden from Surrey Square Primary School. So in order to get ourselves to follow up this discussion, this is our question on Slido for all of us. So how confident are you that these proposals will work, fixing the problems we have in the test and accountability system right now? So from very confident to not at all confident. Okay, so we have, most of us think that we're confident or very confident that this will be the case. But we also have some important, around a third, that think that we are somewhat confident or not confident that this will be the case. Thank you. So now we have the panelists that will be discussing their reflections, identifying the strengths and also the weaknesses of this proposal. So here are the invitation for the panelists, and these are 5 key questions. So will the proposals eliminate the deleterious effects of SATs, including needless pressures on pupil and staff? Will these proposals free up more time for teaching and enhance professional learning? Will they provide richer information for parents or better research evidence for policymakers? What are the chances of getting policy buy-in, and what is needed to make these changes happen? So over to our panelists.
And if I can just remind them to switch on their cameras now. So Joanne, Matt, Margaret, welcome, and please switch on your cameras.
Would you like me to start, Bernie?
Yep, that would be lovely. And if Margaret and Matt can switch their cameras on as well, but Pam needs to switch hers off at the moment. I think we're just having the panel. Right, off you go, Joanne.
Thanks. So I'd like to start by saying that I really support this report. I think there are many aspects of this that would actually be a great improvement on the current system and that look viable to me. I very much welcome the focus on democratic accountability and the different way of thinking about how schools can be accountable. But I should also say that it's been made clear to me that my job in this panel is to encourage debate because we welcome it. It's important that we have different voices and sources of expertise to look at policies which are so important for the country. And indeed, in that way, to create dramatic tension as part of the webinar. So one of the things that I would like to talk about is the fact that the proposal is actually for longitudinal surveys, which would in fact require progress tests. Now, the normal underlying philosophy for progress tests is essentially that children develop cognitively over time. And so you can construct psychometrically tests that require quite heavy duty linking between them so that you can be sure that you have the standard setting right and that indeed your tests operate so that they give you the correct information for different age groups. So typically these tests have been coming from a psychological stable, as you'll see from what I've been saying. But in fact, what we have in this country is curriculum-based tests. And I think really that's what the proposal here is for, progress tests that are curriculum-based. Well, that does throw up a whole range of issues that would have to be solved. And it's partly for this reason, I think, that we don't have lots of these around the world, and there's no reason why we shouldn't be the first to actually make this work. But you might remember that the government, I think the last government, tried to construct something like this with single level tests, where they tried to construct tests for primary pupils actually going into secondary as well, where you could gauge students' progress over time. Now, in the end, that policy wasn't implemented because the curriculum gets in the way. So questions that were very difficult for 14-year-olds turned out to be really quite easy for some 7-year-olds, because they had just that year had that aspect of the curriculum taught to them. So the fact that curriculum intervenes in the difficulty of the items is going to be an issue in constructing these tests. Another issue for this approach, and we found this in the national reference test, is that you actually need a lot of data to be confident in the information that you're getting from the tests. So with a sampling-based method, it can take several years to get to that point. Now, I think the proposal in any case is to have piloting and to work this up, not to rush the implementation. So I think that would be very important. But it does also mean that the release of questions can influence the difficulty of the tests too. So I think there's several things there that would need to be solved, and there'll be creative ways of addressing them, but it might take time. I don't think this would all be available in the way that's envisaged on day one. And then if I may just make one further area of points that relates to sampling. So I think one of the questions that Gemma's just addressed from the audience was about what could be said about individual schools. Now, the thing is that if we want to construct a sample method that allows us to say something about schools, you may as well have a census method, because you need so many pupils from each school that in fact you get very close to the entry for each school in any case. So especially at primary level. So saying something about individual schools is really quite difficult unless you actually target particular schools for a reason. But this leads me to another question which arose for me in reading the report, which is about where accountability should lie in the system. We've become so familiar with the idea that accountability is for schools. Well, one of the issues raised by the report is about thematic analyses, so that we might look at particular groups of children, and it's not clear that schools are actually the best place for accountability to lie for outcomes like that. And indeed, political accountability, whether that be local or national, might be better served in addressing issues such as having an impact on ethnic minority outcomes, or children from low socioeconomic status backgrounds, or with no access to digital technology during the pandemic, and so on. And on that, the pandemic has really taught us that the local and the regional matter, that the context is very different. So again, I think there's a question about how you gather data in such a way that you can say something that's important contextually, locally and regionally. And this whole structure, well, people are commenting that we don't have a system in education in schools in this country anymore, because the landscape has changed so dramatically. So the mention of local authorities feels odd now in terms of accountability for outcomes, because the policies have changed so dramatically that they have very little authority over a lot of what happens in schools. Whereas we have multi-academy trusts, who surely would have to be a feature of the modelling in the landscape going forward. So I think I've taken up my 5 minutes, so I'd better pass on to the next panellist.
Thanks, Joanne. I'm happy to to come in and give some reflections too. I think for me, after reading the report and hearing the presentations today, as a head teacher, I'm really heartened by the proposals because I've seen many years of the damage that the current system does to children in school. I think for us, it's not test. It's like Colvan said earlier. It's not testing that we're necessarily opposed to. It's the way it's done, the way the current system is set up. So the fact that your 7 years of primary schooling comes down to a snapshot of a week of tests in May. And again, in the context of our school, we have 25% of families in temporary accommodation. We've had numerous times where children are evicted during or just before the week of their SATs. So therefore, it impacts them straight away. And again, my point is seeing the fact that there would be a range of assessment tools, a range of different instruments that schools could use, and over time means that it's not down to this snapshot of 1 week in May. We talked about the fact that well-being is such a huge issue, particularly now during the pandemic. We've been working with Impact Ed to help measure our children's well-being and anxiety to get a clearer picture of this. And this year, just before Christmas, when SATs were still supposedly going ahead this year, our year 6 cohort, there were 51% of them that had a higher than average anxiety compared to national. This was on a validated survey that they completed. And then as soon as SATs were then cancelled, the next time we did it in that spring term, it was halved in terms of their anxiety. So it does show the pressure that those children put on themselves, as well as what can come down from above on them too. And this is what we need to make sure that we are really focused on taking away. We haven't had SATs for 2 years now. We just this term, obviously many schools that are watching this, or throughout the country, would have done something different this term. We took it as an opportunity to really see what we could trial differently in school in terms of assessment. We looked at that. We wanted to assess those other skills. Again, working with Impact Ed to come up with some tools for us to use with that. So, we have measured their oracy, we have measured their teamwork, as well as continuing to measure those academic subjects, but using some of the tests, so using some of the SATs papers. So we used some of the arithmetic, but didn't deliver it in the heightened pressure of that this is all down to this paper. They did practical maths. They've built portfolios this term, digital portfolios that give a rounded picture. And have our teachers struggled to then say where they are in terms of age related? No, they haven't. They've actually found that it's been much easier for them because they've got a whole rounded toolkit that they've gathered together, which really does show for us as a school how straight away the negative impact on that week of SATs and what that has on the children. And I really believe unless we move away from this high stakes SATs week, we'll struggle to get schools engaging in that more expansive curriculum that we so much believe in, that curriculum of more of a head, heart and hand. Whereas at the moment, it's much about the head and nothing to do with the values, the problem solving, and the creativity that we know are so essential for children to have to thrive in life as they move forward.
Thank you so much, Matt. Can we now bring in Margaret Greenwood?
Thank you very much, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak and to join in this conversation, which I think is incredibly important. And I think there was a comment in the chat talking about from the NEU about how members are very concerned to see action on this. Certainly, I know myself from interactions I have with teachers, the numbers of teachers who've said to me, we just need to get rid of SATs, huge numbers of teachers. So I think that building the narrative around how SATs are so damaging for children, that they don't put children's well-being at the heart of their education, and that they sap the morale of staff is incredibly important. And I think that we all have a responsibility to promote that. Listening to some of the, there was a comment in the chat, how do we stop benchmarking become high stakes? I think that's a real issue because we have an environment at the moment which is all about competition. So schools competing against each other, and schools having sort of their, having to draw parents towards them and say, my school is better than the school down the road. And I feel it's very damaging. So I think that in terms of the system that's described, that's a really important question. And I know, Gemma, you did answer it, but I think it is sort of a question. Apologies that Gemma, you answered the other one. But I think that's an important question, because I think that you would, under the current way in which schools are organised, still continue to see a situation whereby there is that competition between schools. I was wondering, for example, whether you might have a situation arise where, and I do like the idea of having this greater range of things that can be assessed, because there's already been commented, things like teamwork and oracy and so forth definitely need to be given a higher profile than they currently are. But I did wonder whether you might find a situation arising whereby schools in deprived areas might opt to go for tests X, and schools in more prosperous areas might go for test Y, and that somehow you might get a sort of situation where some schools are boasting about the fact that they give harder tests and more academic tests to their children than other schools. And so that's quite difficult to manage, and I'd be interested to hear hear what the thoughts on that would be. And also similarly that you might get a sort of stigmatism. I'm almost thinking back to what it used to be with whether your child did O-level or CSE. Well, we only teach CSE in this school, so therefore it's not as good a school. So I wondered how that could be mitigated against. The question around whether it will free up more teaching time and enhance professional learning, I think it's a really important question. I mean, it should do. One of the things that occurred to me was that it might involve the requirement for teachers to have more professional development, because particularly maybe teachers who've been in teaching for a shorter period of time, might be very wedded to the current way of doing things. And whilst I do believe there's a strong impetus to get rid of SATs, nonetheless, you then have to replace it with something and give people the professional development opportunities to, really enhance their teaching and understand how they can develop oracy and how they can develop teamwork and so forth. So I think that would be something that would need consideration. And then the idea of giving richer information to parents is incredibly important. But what you wouldn't want to see would be somehow there being an expectation suddenly that parents are getting, that it wouldn't be framed as a test in a sense. So you want more communication between parents and schools. But by the same token, I think you'd want to be able to be clear about what that might mean in terms of teacher workload, and also whether it might then give rise to, other undesirable outcomes, such as maybe parents worrying about other things other than the academic performance of their children. So the framing of it will be very important, I think. In terms of chances of getting policy buy-in, I thought, the presentation this afternoon was really, really helpful. For me, I think being a member of Parliament and thinking, I used to be a school teacher and I've taught in colleges and things, so I've got an interest in education, but I'm thinking about when you look at the broad range of people who are members of Parliament, the vast majority of them haven't worked in education, but large numbers of them have been parents. So I think what's important is to describe the problem in simple terms. So the impact on pupils, and their learning, teachers and also parents, and also the impact on morale. I think when one of the speakers was talking about the fact that this would be a lower cost, that would definitely be of interest to politicians, I am sure. But also, so describing, the problem needs to be described in very simple terms, really, so that people know that it would catch on the doorstep. So if you're knocking on a door and talking to somebody, what's the issue with your children's school? If the answer is they're getting tested too much and they're really stressed, well, then that's a problem that politicians can understand. So making sure there's clarity around what those problems are and why we need to address them. I thought in the report, referencing what happens in other countries was really useful, because one of the things I think that politicians and members of the public respond to is this idea that somehow they do things differently somewhere else and it's better than what we get. So the idea that our children are getting a poor deal compared to, say, Finland, where there's no tests at the end of primary school, or New Zealand that allows schools to set the curriculum and assess their pupils. Using those sorts of, well, different countries do it differently, why do we do it like this here, I think is a very useful way of, if you like, encouraging a positive narrative around the potential for change and that it's doable. Because otherwise it just reverts back to, you know, the current way in which children are tested and the way in which our schools are measured against each other is so embedded that I think it is quite difficult to challenge.
Thank you so much, Margaret, Joanne, and Matt. We are going to move now to our last section, which will be the Q&A, but we have another Slido question for us all. So how confident are you that now is the right time to argue for these changes? And again, from very confident to not at all confident.
Wow.
We're extremely confident. So very confident and confident, the great majority, but we have also around 18% or 26% that we are not somewhat confident or not at all confident. Thank you. So let's move now to our Q&A. I've been monitoring the Slido. It's been really a pleasure. We have around 42 questions, and it's impossible for us to answer all these questions. So if your question is not answered, please email us afterwards, because we would love to carry on this discussion. So I've been summarizing the questions, and I would say in 3 main topics. The first one is about implementation. So how much it will cost, how long it will take, and what if we are thinking about facing this process, how in order to make it real. There's a lot of questions about that.
If I perhaps come in on that, I was very struck by what Joanne said right at the very start. She had raised some deep questions about the nature of the assessment instruments that we need assessment experts to come in on. I think she's very wise to say this will take time. I think for me, therefore, the question is, how can we get the political buy-in to create the time? You know, it comes back down to what Margaret was saying. It's so interesting listening to that policymaker perspective on what leads to politicians thinking, yeah, let's go this way, because it needs a commitment. And I think we see this as the start of a conversation. It's trying to say this is possible. If there's a will, how could we build it, rather than let's do everything at a stroke straight away. Maybe the kind of description that Matt is giving of what his school is doing this year in the absence of formal testing, to nevertheless stay on top of and be able to inform parents, is really important here. I think if we go this way, it requires conversation and dialogue. It doesn't require imposition. And the changing that dialogue away from a system built around competition, we can't fool ourselves it's going to be easy. I think if we collectively campaign on it, for me now is the right moment, because COVID really has bust the accountability system as is. There is an opportunity to build back better. There's a very strong sense of that at the level of schools. Can we get a conversation going between schools, parents, local politicians that will actually create the mood for change?
I'd like to come in too to respond, and thank you very much to all our panelists for their very valuable points. I think we make clear in the report, which is more detailed than what we could show in our rather hurried presentation, we do anticipate this would take a number of years to bring in, and SATs would be phased out after that. We have seen a system with the pandemic where we haven't had SATs, and we've realised, as indeed with the GCSEs, that reliance on those external tests when something happens, a major event, is unwise. I quite take the point we wouldn't want a two-tier system of the, this is taking a CSE or an O-level approach, but in the primary school about the test. But I think developing better assessments would be beneficial and encouraging their use. The professional development that Margaret mentioned is very important. We want to avoid stigmatizing. We want to empower teachers. We want to be better informed. Perhaps we didn't make clear, we're using progress in a more general sense, Joanne. You rightly said that there are great difficulties with psychometric approaches. We're not seeking to have psychometric based approaches. We just want to follow children up longitudinal and see what happens to their outcomes at different points, whatever are deemed to be the most relevant outcomes. We do this in many longitudinal studies. We don't have to have a psychometric approach to measure progress in that way. We can look and see how students were achieving and their development at different ages, and what that looks like with whatever are the most appropriate and relevant assessments at later points in their school career, whether at the end of primary, moving on from an earlier point in primary, or whether it's in year 9, or whether it's when we then look at GCSE, because the GCSE tests are not psychometric, and we often use baseline tests to measure progress and development. So I don't think we should be hung up on that. And Harvey was very knowledgeable on all these issues and informed our thinking. So perhaps we haven't given Harvey's viewpoint over as clearly as we should, but it's not something we haven't considered. And we are not arguing for a psychometric system that puts all children on a normal distribution and assumes that you can look at curriculum development at particular. We're quite aware when you've recently studied something, an assessment will pick it up, and that's why teaching to the test can give you a misleading picture of performance. If you haven't looked at it for a number of years, when you're 14, it might be harder than it was when you were 8 or 9 and you'd more recently studied it. So we need to be sensible with assessments, and that's why we always say there's uncertainty with any assessment. And I don't have to tell you that, Joanne, you know far more about that than I do. But we think this is an opportune moment to start taking forward these kinds of discussions, finding assessment that's fit for purpose. And the key thing is to make better learning experiences for children, better use of teaching and learning resources and teachers and children's time in primary school, and to have a greater focus on balanced curriculum for the children so that we can monitor a range of important areas. We know literacy and numeracy, we're not saying don't have it, but we want to look at other rich areas too. And I think our two heads have helped us with that, Matt and Carbon.
Thank you, Pam. There's another set of questions that are very linked to this, and are those questions about inspection. So who will be accountable? Will be the school? Will we change that unit? What will be the role of local education authorities? What will be the role of multi-academy trusts? Are we changing that purpose? And how Ofsted would operate with different information? There's a lot of questions around how the system transforms accountability.
May I come in on that one, Gemma, and then hand over to you? We are deliberately making our proposals such that a school is not judged on the performance of a whole group of pupils. That's the key to matrix samples. You will not be publishing data about the subsample of children who take particular items in the matrix at the school level. You are shifting the system away. Schools will still have inspection. We hope the inspection will be better informed by research evidence based on the national longitudinal samples and based on the purposes of education, and focusing more on the curriculum, the broad and balanced. And we hope that by looking very much at the equity aspect at different groups of children's performance and achievements and developments in different contexts, it might be neighbourhood, it might be local authority. We were proposing the local authority as sampling. We're quite aware local authorities don't have much power now. It might be through looking at maps, because you will be able to link the students to those features. And we would look at subset coastal areas. Ofsted has picked up in the past under their previous chief inspector as a crucial area.
Okay.
Small schools might be another area of importance. We want inspection to be more nuanced and intelligent, but I'll hand over to Gemma now. She wants to come in.
I think it's important to understand that we are not trying to hold schools to account for performance on exactly the same range of tests as everybody else. We're trying to hold the system to account. How is it functioning over time? If something terrible should be happening around COVID that prevents, I don't know, maths teaching going on, a national sample should be able to reveal that. It should then be capable of being used by politicians to steer investment. I mean, at the moment, we don't know how long COVID is going to go on for. Let's get proper investment in IT so that schools can operate with fairness in access to digital learning at home, but there's also going to be a CPD need. There is no clarity at the moment on what is high quality use of digital technology to support children's learning at home. Okay, you could put the money in around that. So it's a system level accountability, I think, that we're wanting to see, with policymakers accountable for the decisions that they are making about where to invest. I think why we've sort of talked so much about democratic is because we recognise that the system as it currently runs is inadequate. Again, going back to COVID research we're conducting at the moment, we are very well aware that schools are now very differently resourced. There's a huge amount of responsibility rests on the shoulders of the head of the individual primary school to make things happen okay here. Okay, some schools are in, and I know Matt is in, a very supportive environment in his academy chains. Other academy chains may be issuing orders from afar. But does that help them? No. Other schools may be very vulnerable because they're not well connected. Others may be absolutely benefiting from a very well organised local authority. Those are unevennesses in the system that hinder schools doing better. We want a system that's built to enable schools to do better everywhere. And that's why we're really putting the emphasis on self-evaluation, school improvement plans informed by research evidence. It's got to run through this if it's going to work.
And the third and final overall
I would like to come back on that for one moment, if I may, Bernie. I think the resourcing that Gemma has mentioned is very important. I conducted a national evaluation of children's centres. I happened to look at a recent report that came out just before the weekend. There's been a 59% cut in resourcing for early years in local authorities' budgets. It's affected disadvantaged areas most. COVID has tended to affect disadvantaged areas most. The way since 2015 that school resourcing has altered is particularly driven more by pupil numbers rather than by pupil need. That has also affected schools serving the most disadvantaged communities. So we do need resources to be redirected to support the outcomes if we want to promote equity. And that is not happening at the moment. And we hope this system would help to draw in resources to support school improvement, professional development of teachers and children's learning experiences, and particularly help to rebalance the system, which is very much against good learning opportunities for children in the most disadvantaged areas at the moment. There's no two ways about it. It's got a lot worse.
Thank you so much to our panelists, discussants and participants. It's been really interesting discussion. There will be a recording of this so we can follow up that, after. And I wanted to mention that the third area of inquiry was about if this was going to help closing the disadvantage gap. And the answer would be yes. This is a system that it has equity at the heart. So thank you so much for discussing, and we hope we will together will pull together for making this happen. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.